Well, hello everyone. Today we are doing the historical fiction book tag. I was kindly tagged by Angie over at Science Mama. If you haven't checked her out and you like historical fiction, you are missing out. She's wonderful. So I'm really excited about this tag. You guys know I do read widely. I definitely do read scary books, but I also love my historical fiction. There is something comforting in going back to historical fiction. So let's dive into the questions. First question is, what is your favorite time period to read about? And I was sitting and thinking about this, and mine is like oddly very specific. It's not only a time period, it's like a place as well. So for me, it's World War II, but London during the Blitz. I really love reading books about the Blitz in London, even in the English countryside as well. I also find it really interesting to read about the journey of the kids who are often sent out of the city and into the countryside to go and stay with random families in the country to try to keep them safe. And I always find those stories interesting, but more interesting to me is definitely the Blitz. The way writers write about the bombings, I shouldn't be smiling about it because it was absolutely horrendous for so many people, but it's so interesting how devastating they were, but also how resilient the London people were to just get on with their lives the next day. And it says something about the human experience that we can adjust so quickly to the most horrible things in the world. Is it good? Is it bad? I don't know. It's just human, and I find it very fascinating. Question number 2, what book made you fall in love with historical fiction? And I had a hard time thinking of this one. I really kind of narrowed in on The Orphan Train by Christina Baker Klein, specifically because this got me out of a reading slump. Like, when I say reading slump, I mean I had been feeling slumpy for years. I had done an English lit degree, and I had really separated myself from reading fiction. I read a lot of nonfiction, but not fiction. And I picked up The Orphan Train, which is about a young girl who was on a real train that existed that would go from state to state, and these orphans would get off of the train and the villagers would come by and go, I want that girl, I want that boy to work my farm fields or what have you. And it was about her journey and another little boy who was also an orphan that she met along the way. I just was totally into the story, and it really got me out of a slump and got me really back into reading. So I have that book to thank. So that's the book that I thought of. Question number 3, if you could write yourself into any historical fiction time period or visit a time period, what would it be and why? Now, I am a woman, so I can't imagine wanting to go into a time period before now for a long period of time. Women didn't have the same amount of rights, obviously, that we do now. A lot of other people did not have the same amount of rights that they do now. And I can't imagine wanting to stay anytime, really anytime. But I did think that it would be interesting, just out of curiosity's sake, to visit right around World War I, when the Spanish flu was at its height, just because we're in a pandemic now, and the last time there was a pandemic was then. And I'd love to know what people's reactions were, because, you know, people now have such adverse reactions. People are for masks, people are against masks, people are for vaccines, people are against vaccines. And it's so polarizing. I would love to go back to that time and see how people were then. Did they rally together, or was there the same kind of angst and butting heads that there is now? I'm kind of curious. I guess I could just read a book about that time. instead, and I'll probably do that since it's impossible to time travel. But that's probably what I would choose. And I probably only want to go for like maybe a day or two, knowing that I was not going to contract that and then bring it into this time period. That's the last thing we need. Look at me worrying about the idea of time traveling. It's just in your mind. It's just imagining, April. You don't have to. Moving on to the next question. Question number 4. Have you read a historical fiction book that was so gripping that it sent you into a research deep dive? Now, I would honestly personally put this on my contemporary shelves, but most people would think of it as historical fiction. It's The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. This is about a young boy who is Black, and he is sent to a school. Really wasn't a school, it was more like a boys' prison. And the idea was that they were to better themselves and then move on with their lives. And there was an obscene amount of abuse at this school. And so Colson Whitehead based this school on a school that existed in Florida. And so after reading the book, which I fell completely in love with, I started researching more about the Florida school and just found that really fascinating and very sad, because there was a grave site found of unmarked graves, so filled with these boys who, had gotten sick or were terribly abused. And I think about this book a lot right now, obviously, because of the residential schools in Canada. All across Canada, they are finding these unmarked graves of Indigenous girls and boys who were horribly, horribly treated by our country, by the churches, by the state. And I think about this book all the time because of what's going on in Canada and what people are discovering. And it's devastating. It's devastating. And I definitely want to read more about residential schools. I am currently reading This Tender Land by William Kent Kruger. It's very good, but it's written by a white man. And so I definitely prefer to read, obviously, fiction or nonfiction about residential schools by Indigenous peoples, because own stories and own voices. But yeah, I just loved that book, and it sent me on a deep dive in more ways than one. Question number 5, do you have a favorite or Autobuy historical fiction author? And I thought of 2 that I really could not choose between. The first is Susan Meissner. I've now only read 2 of her books, but I own, I think, all of her books. I just love her stories so much. She always takes usually slightly obscure storylines in history that aren't written about quite a lot. And then she explores those historical facts and what happened at that time, but she also takes an issue, a problem that a person living in that time is experiencing and adds that into it. So it's just this layered, lovely story. And I just know I'm in good hands with Susan Meissner every single time. The other author is Kate Morton. Oh my goodness. Now, I have read every Kate Morton. Have I liked every single one? Absolutely not. I think there are 2 of hers that I really didn't connect with, but I'll read every book that she comes out with. And Kate Morton does this beautiful thing. She writes historical fiction mysteries. And in these books, she often goes back and forwards in time. And there's always a person in the present day trying to find out the mysteries of the past. And she's such a comfort read to me. Oh my goodness. When I pick up a Kate Morton, I just feel like, okay, I'm now gonna hunker down and just enjoy and just let myself be taken away by her prose and her mysteries and just like That's my version of a cozy mystery, you know? Question number 6, what is your favorite historical fiction movie or TV show? So hard to choose. Movies, I loved Brooklyn. Oh my goodness, that's also a book that I haven't read. I also really love Julie and Julia. I absolutely love The Light Between Oceans. It's just as good as the book, and that's one of my favorite books of all time. I love Little Women. So lots of movies that I adore. I also really love The Crown for historical fiction shows, and then like Downton Abbey. Downton Abbey is the kind of show that I really do rewatch probably once every 3 years, just to like, it's just comforting. It's just comforting. Question number 7. I'm gonna look down at my little computer for this. Historical fiction is often overlooked or underhyped in the Booktube world. What book would you recommend that would hook any reader on the genre? And so I broke this down into like what they usually would read. I got overzealous, obviously. So if they usually read YA, I would recommend The Book Thief to them. It is historical fiction YA, and it is incredible, about a little girl living during World War II in Germany, and she is taken in by a couple who are so sweet, and she is trying to have a childhood in the midst of a war and being on that side of things. And she's really struggling with the idea of Germany having these beliefs that she doesn't align herself with. And she is best friends with a little boy down the street, and it's about their friendship, and it's about finding home and finding comfort within books. It's just the most wonderful story, and it's written from the perspective of death. Death is the narrator, so you know not everyone's gonna live in this book, and I cried like a baby at the end of reading that, so I definitely recommend that for my YA fans. Now, if they read literary fiction books, I would recommend Hamnet to them by Maggie O'Farrell. Hamnet follows Shakespeare's young son, Hamnet, who actually died during the plague. And it follows the days leading up to his death, and it follows the days after his death, the weeks after his death, and explores grief in one of the most brutally honest ways I've read. And it was wonderful, and you really get to know Shakespeare's wife, who you can't help but fall in love with, Agnes. But it's obviously gorgeously written. So if you like literary fiction, I think you would enjoy Hamnet. Now, if you are a thriller reader, I would probably recommend Affinity by Sarah Waters. It's definitely gothic in nature. This follows a woman who has tried to commit suicide and it didn't work. And there is punishment for doing that. And in her case, she is forced to volunteer at a women's prison, and she meets a woman there, a prisoner, who is there because she is a spiritualist. She was conducting a seance, and an old woman at the seance died. So she's in prison, and it's about their relationship. It's very dark. It's like Victorian London, very, very dark, very gritty, that side of London. And I found it eerie for sure, and suspenseful. So I think that if you like thrillers, even horror, because of the whole spiritualist aspect of it, you might enjoy Affinity. And then if you read classics, oh my goodness, one of the best books that I read this year is The Other Bennet Sister. This follows Mary and Mary's story from Pride and Prejudice, and it reimagines her experience, and it made me fall in love. Like, she might now be my favorite Bennet sister. What? So if you liked Pride and Prejudice, if you read classics, I think that you would really enjoy The Other Bennet Sister. And also I listened to it on audio, and it was incredible. So those are all of the questions. I think I'd like to tag a couple of people. Katie over at Life Between Words, she hasn't been posting lately, but maybe this will entice her to come back to the fold and post again. And then also Krista over at Books and Jams, just because I know that she loves historical fiction. Or honestly, Angie probably already tagged her, but if she didn't, I tag you, Krista. I hope that you guys are doing well, and I will chat with you tomorrow. Bye, guys.